But first to an interesting twist in the national political tale at the moment. While the two major party leaders engage in an increasingly tense and bitter strategic battle for ascendancy as the election clock ticks down, several of Kevin Rudd's senior ministers are concerned about their own personal vulnerability, not to the coalition, but to the Greens. And some of those seats are not even marginal. Ever since Kevin Rudd parked his emissions trading legislation to combat climate change in the too hard basket until 2013, Labor's stocks have slumped and the Greens' support has peaked. Under Bob Brown's leadership, the Greens are driving hard, not only to win the balance of power in the Senate in their own right, but to pick up their first ever lower house seat. And the man most in the firing line is Finance Minister Lindsay Tanner, who holds his inner city seat of Melbourne with just 4.7%. Political editor Heather Hewitt reports.
I can ask you a few quick questions. What issues are important to you at the moment?
Have you thought about how you're going to vote this year?
Your vote is really important, so I've said to you.
At an inner suburban Melbourne pub on a Saturday morning, disaffected Labor voters are learning how to door knock and campaign for the Greens to try to oust Finance Minister Lindsay Tanner from the seat of Melbourne at the next election.
I don't think we're doing enough on climate change.
It's the fourth training session in the past month and business is booming as the Greens move to smarten up their campaign tactics.
We've looked closely at campaigns like the Obama campaign in the US and the Your Rights at Work campaign. Last time Labor would have spent over $400,000 in this seat. We expect they'll spend more this time. We can't match that. But we've got people, and we've got people who are willing more than ever to sign up. We've got people leaving the Labor Party coming and helping us campaign.
Are you aware that there are actually elections going on this year?
Some worked on Lindsay Tanner's campaign at the last election. Others are changing the voting habits of a lifetime after the government's recent backflips on climate change, asylum seekers and childcare centres.
I certainly haven't always supported the Greens. In fact, previously for 4 decades I've been a Labor voter.
You campaigned for Lindsay Tanner for Labor last election. Now you're moving over to the Greens. Why?
I think what happened over time is that increasingly I realised that the way I felt and the values that I held were no longer reflected in the party I was supporting.
I've joined the Greens reasonably recently. I've actually come across from the ALP.
The big issue that's turned it for me is climate change and their performance on that.
I was delighted when the Rudd government got in. I worked on that campaign very hard. I was pleased. But I think since then there's a sense of disappointment that we had, that the opportunity's been squandered.
There may not be an election date yet, but in Melbourne, the Greens campaign has been off and running for weeks. The launch of its campaign office last night, a mere formality.
This is more advanced than any campaign has been that we've run here in Victoria.
This is not a case of simply dislodging Lindsay Tanner, who's as safe in Melbourne as John Howard was in his seat at the last election.
The seat is so close that all it will take is 1 in 10 people who voted Labor last time switching their vote over to Greens, and we win our first ever seat at a general election.
Melbourne, you can make history. I'm looking forward to this campaign with great enthusiasm.
Do you fear for your own seat?
My seat's just one of a number that are and have been under threat for some time.
Lindsay Tanner is a worried man. His once safe Labor seat of Melbourne has been vulnerable to the Greens since 2001, and he now holds it by just 4.7%.
Okay, big smiles, everybody.
He's long regarded the Greens as a huge threat to Labor, but recent opinion polls have no doubt heightened his anxiety.
We are now on the verge of losing lower house seats to the Greens, both at the national and at the state level in at least a couple of seats. We've already lost one in the seat of Fremantle in Western Australia.
Let me make it very clear, we are not a faction or a ginger group or a lobby organisation. We are this nation's third biggest political party, and we are intending to grow in our representation in parliaments.
There's no doubt that the government has done a few things that could chisel off more Labor support and give it over to the Greens.
That's what the Greens are banking on. And Lindsay Tanner knows it's going to take more than this week's announcement of more adventure playgrounds in his electorate to stem the voter backlash in his seat over the government's backdown on the emissions trading scheme, for example. He seeks to blame the Greens.
Ironically, one of the key reasons it's happened, of course, is because the Greens voted it down in the Senate. There's no question there is some degree of concern about a number of issues. But I always say to those people, look at the bigger picture. The reality of life for a party that is seeking to win government from the progressive end of the spectrum is that you cannot do everything. You're always going to have to make compromises.
But has this government made too many compromises for the more progressive elements of this diverse inner-city electorate?
You pay $25 anywhere else, only $5 here for you people.
That includes high-rise commission flats, blue-collar workers and immigrants, along with students, academics and the upwardly mobile white-collar constituency.
Now, where Labor decides it's going to try to appeal to one of its constituency blocks on these issues, there's the real danger of alienating the other one. And one of the interesting things about the last 4 months of the Rudd government is that, for reasons best known to itself, it's decided it's going to try and consolidate its support amongst the blue-collar constituency.
I'm Adam. I'm the local Greens candidate for the federal elections.
That leaves the disgruntled progressive voters in this electorate providing fertile ground for the Greens. It's the same story in inner-city seats in Sydney, held by Ministers Tanya Plibersek and Anthony Albanese. But the Greens see Lindsay Tanner's seat as their best chance because at the last election, candidate Adam Bandt ran second to Tanner with the help of Liberal preferences.
This is the great irony. The only reason the Greens are a threat to me, to Anthony Albanese, to Tanya Plibersek, to the various state MPs and ministers, is because the Liberals give them their preferences.
Well, if you go on the 2007 election result, it was the one seat in Australia where the two-party preferred came down to a contest between Labor and the Greens. In other words, the Greens outpolled the coalition.
The truth is the Greens are about cannibalising progressive Labor votes. They're not that interested in who the government is. They're not that interested in trying to defeat John Howard or Tony Abbott. They're interested in defeating people like me.
He's obviously somewhat rattled.
The important thing is that prospective Green voters need to understand that underneath all that overblown windbaggery and rhetoric is a sinister purpose, and that is not to defeat the Conservatives, it is to defeat the Labor Party.
The battle lines are drawn, and whatever the outcome in Melbourne, the Greens figure the more resources they can pour into Victoria, the better, because this is about trying to win an extra Senate spot too. The Greens are keen to hold the balance of power in the Senate in their own right. Analysis they've commissioned points to them having a very strong chance of pulling that off and picking up a Senate seat in Victoria. Family First Senator Steve Fielding, who got in on Labor preferences in 2004, can't rely on the same deal this time. For the government, the prospect of more Greens in the Senate carries pluses and minuses.
I actually think it would be probably to the government's advantage. What the government has struggled with at the moment is trying to coordinate three sets of crossbenchers: the Greens, Family First and Nick Xenophon, the independent from South Australia.
Oh, I think responsibly, you'll find if you probe a little there, Lindsay Tanner will be very pleased that the Greens had the balance of power in the Senate.
The prospect of one party that basically sees the Labor Party as its enemy and who is focused not on taking votes for the Conservatives but focused on taking votes from Labor as the holder of the balance of power in its own right in the Senate has got some obvious downsides.
We've convinced increasing numbers in the electorate that we have the economic credibility and responsibility.
It's a prospect the government is going to have to get used to if the Greens keep up their Victorian campaign momentum.
That report from Heather Hewitt.